So what we're going to have a look at in this video is we're going to try and add some more detail into our two-piece mold that we made in the last video. So if you've run through that video, or if you haven't run through that video, you need to work through the steps in that first in order to get to this point. But a brief overview of what we've done is we imported a reference model, which in this case was our handle design that we've been working on in previous weeks. So this was our handle design. On this particular iteration of it, I've turned the pattern on the top of it off, so I've temporarily suppressed that. It doesn't really matter for this exercise whether you have the pattern visible or whether you have it suppressed as we have here. So yeah, broadly speaking, we imported a copy of our part design. We created a block of material around that part. We then used various tools to allow us to split that block of material into two sections, which will be the two halves of our mold. And then eventually, as we ran through some other steps here, we ended up with two new parts. So this is the first part. This is the half of the mold that is responsible for molding the external surfaces of our handle. And then if we go back to the mold assembly here, we've got the other half of the mold at the bottom, so I can open that up. So this half of the mold is responsible for molding all the surfaces on the inside of our handle design. So you can see the negative shape of the ribs here specifically. So we ran through all those steps. We created these two halves of our mold, and now what we're going to look at is we're going to look at some of the more advanced features that you can add to a mold. When you get to this point where you have your basic two-piece mold, there are production features, so there's a section of the menu here related to production features that you can add to this mold, and then you can create the as molded shape that you will see ejected from the mold after the molten plastic has solidified. So that as molded shape will have additional pieces of geometry attached to your part design. It will have a piece of geometry which is where the plastic was injected. So that will be the gate location. And you can add this geometry to the mold and then essentially take a dummy molding of the as molded shape. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to add a runner to the mold to deliver the plastic, and we're also going to put some features into our mold which are air vents. So when we've been using the mold analysis tools within Creo, often you'll be confronted with issues which are highlighted by that analysis to do with trapped air within the mold. And the system draws your attention to these problems, and it tries to come up with possible solutions to minimize those problems. And one of the solutions that it mentions is you may need to think about venting the mold, so adding vents into the mold to let the air escape. So we're going to look at ways that you might add vents into your mold design in the molding assembly environment here. So let's put a runner into our mold design first. So what I'm going to do before I begin, I'm going to hide some of these original parts that were imported because I don't really want to see them as I'm working on these two resultant mold volumes. So what I'm going to do, so if we just sort of visualize where our finished part is within this design, so you can see that if I look down from above, I'm looking at the outside of the handle, and then if I look from below here, I'm looking at the inside surfaces of the handle. And what I want to do is I want to create a runner for my molten material to run down that runs broadly into the center area of the inside of the handle here. So that's what I'm hoping to achieve. So I'm going to select where it says runner at the top of the screen here. So I'll just move these menus out of the way of the mouse button previews that I've got running at the top of the screen there. So what shape do I want my runner? I think I'm going to have a round runner. So this is the cross-sectional shape of the hole that the plastic is going to run through. So round. So I've selected that. So I've told the system I'm going to create a runner. I've told it the shape, the cross-sectional shape of the runner. Then it's asking me what size do you want this runner to be. Well, the default size in the molding analysis for our gates is 3mm diameter. So I think I'll set these as 3mm. So I'm working in millimeters, that's my units. So I enter 3 there, click OK. And then what it's asking me to define is the flow path. So this is, it knows that this pathway is going to be circular in cross section. I've already defined that. I just have to draw a straight line. It doesn't have to be a straight line, it can go around corners, but in this case it's just going to be a simple straight line defining where that circular channel is to begin on the mold and where that circular channel is going to end in the mold. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to create that straight line sketch on this mold plane. And that's what it's asking me for specifically at the moment. You can see at the bottom of the screen it's saying select or create a sketching plane to create this line sketch on. So I'm going to pick the mold right hand plane. Then I get an arrow indicating which direction I'll be viewing that plane when I come to sketch on it. So in this case it's saying I'll be viewing it from this end of the mold. I'm happy with that, but if I wasn't I could flip the direction. So I'm going to OK that. Then it's saying how do you want your sketch view oriented? So just to illustrate what it means by that. So this would be one orientation. I know which direction I'm looking at the plane from. I'll see if I can rotate my view here. Easier said than done. So that would be another orientation. So it's essentially defining what direction am I going to class as up on this sketching plane. So I don't really mind, so I think I'll just leave it as the default. I don't really want to kind of play around with that too much, so I'll just say default direction please. Then what am I looking at here? It's somewhat easy to tell which direction the mold is oriented or which direction the molded part will be oriented, but I'd like to see a bit more detail, so I'm going to turn my view to wireframe so I can see all the detail through these blocks of solid material like that. And essentially what I want to do is I want to create a channel that runs from the outside of this molding block all the way along here till it reaches the inside surface of my finished part there. So that's what I'm hoping to create. So I'll get my line tool, I'll let it lock itself onto the outside surface of the molding block there. I'll sketch along here until I reach what I believe to be the inside surface of my part, and I believe it's that surface there. I may have to come in and change that if I'm mistaken and I've gone a little bit too far, but we'll assume that's where it is. And then what it's offering to do, as it always does when we're using the line tool, is it's offering me the ability to draw more lines attached to this original line, but I don't want to do that, so I'm going to press escape to get out of the line tool. Then what it shows me as a preview is the width of my channel that I have just outlined or defined. So that width there I can assume is 3mm. So from there up to there is 3mm. So it draws a 3mm channel around the line that I have created. And the 3mm channel begins here and it ends here. So that is where my molten material will be supplied. So I don't need to do anything else in this sketch. I've defined the path of my runner, so I can click OK to OK this sketch. And then what I need it to do is I need it to search through all the components here for any components that are affected by this runner. And I can select them manually, but I can also click on automatic and it will find any components that are affected by the path of this runner. So automatic is fine for our purposes. And then I'm just going to click on OK. And then at this point I could get a preview of what's going to occur, or I could just OK the feature and I could inspect what the result of it is. So I'm going to just OK the feature. And then because I'm in wireframe mode, I can sort of appreciate what's being created there. But if I want to get a sort of more realistic preview of that, I can come back out of wireframe mode and go back into shaded with edges mode. And then I can spot that yes, there is indeed a runner channel there that seems to do what I intended it to do. And if I want to inspect that a little bit more clearly, I can select this half of the mold, so volume 2, and open it in its own window, so that icon there. So that is what I've created. I've created a channel that runs through this half of the mold that I would assume when you were machining the mold from a solid block of material, you would just drill a 3mm hole down through the mold there. So back to the assembly. So we're back in the assembly now. So we've created a runner. What it would be nice to do now is to create this dummy molding. And what I mean by that is we have our reference model in here. So that's what the reference model looks like. But that isn't what our molding will look like when it is ejected from the mold. What our molding will look like when it is ejected from the mold is it will have what's known as a sprue sticking up in the center here. And that will be the solidified material that was sat in that runner channel when we supplied it to the mold. So if we go back to the assembly, what we can do is we can create a molding. Using these two molding tools, we can essentially put molten plastic into the cavity, including the runner that we've just created. So create molding, enter part name. You've got to give this molding a part name, so I might call it molding. Then I'll press enter. Then it's asking me for a common name. I don't have to actually enter anything into this box. Just giving it molding.prt as its name is fine. So I'm just going to click OK on that box. Then the molding that I've just created gets highlighted in green, but if I want to inspect it more thoroughly, I can open it in its own part window. And there it is. So that is essentially what we're going to get out of our mold when we finish molding this part. And the nice thing here is we can now use this part in molding analysis. So we can take this through to molding analysis, and we can put our gate location on the top of this this column here, and we can simulate the plastic flowing down there and into the mold cavity. So we've added a runner to our mold. What else can we do? Well, we can add a representation of these air traps that we were talking about earlier. And the way that we're going to do that is we're going to open this half of the mold, and we're essentially going to machine very shallow channels into the mating surface of the mold here. So this blue surface is the surface that touches the other half of the mold. And currently in this model there is no gap between them at all. But we're going to machine very shallow little channels into this surface just to allow those air pockets to exit through those channels. But hopefully the material won't be able to get down those channels, or if it does, it will be a very fine, very thin skirt of material that can be easily broken away when the moulding's complete. So we're just going to do this as simply as possible. We're going to click on this top surface, tell the system that we're going to create an extrude. So we're going to use the extrude tool to extrude remove material. Then the system's confused because we don't have any datum planes in this part, we've already said. Because these parts are generated using the moulding assembly tools, you don't get any datum planes, you don't get a datum coordinate system. But For this example, we can use the edges of the molding tool itself as references to put any dimensions on. So I've got the edges of the tool as references. I'm then just going to get my simple line tool again, and I'm just going to draw a line from this edge of the molding tool down to this edge of the molding tool, and then press escape twice. Then I'm going to set the distance of this line to be, let's say, 5 millimeters in. Let's say a little bit more, just so it kind of interacts with the well, let's leave it at 5 millimeters there, and then we'll OK that. So it's just a simple line. So then when I come into the extrude tool, I don't get a preview because I've not created a closed boundary of edges. But within the extrude tool, there's a setting, this setting here, which if I hover over it, it adds thickness to the line itself. So if I click that, at the moment it's adding 0.6 millimeters of thickness. I want something a bit thicker than that. Let's go for 3 millimeters. So you can see it's taking that line that I've given it as a piece of sketch geometry, and it's adding material on one side of the line. If I want to add material on the other side of the line, I can use this option here. So I'm just clicking on that. You can see there's 3 settings. There's what we would consider the right hand side of the line, there's the left hand side of the line, and then there's having the line midpoint in the middle of our 3 millimeters. I think we'll set it as the midpoint. Then I want to reverse the direction of this extrude, so I'm going to click on that arrow there. I want to remove material with this extrude, and I want to make the depth very, very shallow. So typically the vents within the mold will be 40 microns or less. So I'm going to set them at probably 0.04 millimeters deep. So not very deep at all, just a slight little witness mark on the mold. So that's all I'm going to do. So that one in and of itself isn't going to allow any air to escape. But what I'm going to do now is I'm going to select that extruded feature, and I'm going to pattern it across the mold surface. So I'm going to click on pattern. The type of pattern that I'm going to create is a directional pattern. So I'm going to specify a direction that I want to make copies of that extrude in. So that's what it's waiting for here. I need to select something that defines the direction that I'm going to pattern in. So I'm going to use the edge of the mold. So I want to pattern in the direction of that edge there. So click on the edge. How many pattern members? I'll experiment a little bit here, but I'll set this at 10 initially. The space in between them, let's try 5. See what that's like. Maybe a little bit more, maybe something like 8. That looks a little bit better for our needs. So I'll probably increase the quantity a bit more. Let's see what happens when we OK that. We can always come back in and modify this. So click on OK. So there's something untoward happening here. We're corrupting this piece of the geometry of the mold. So maybe I wouldn't have it go quite so far. So I'm going back in and editing this pattern. So maybe if we reduce this down to 19 pattern members, that might be more suitable. Yes, that's a good start. So what we've done is we've created these little kind of channels in our mold. So now when I go back into the assembly, the molding assembly, and then I look at my molded part, I may have to do a refresh or a regenerate there. You could see I pressed regenerate so that all those changes that I'd made to the mold got carried through into this molded part. I end up with a molded part that looks something like this. So it has these little skirts that stick out of the side. And if I want to measure these just to check their depth, I can go into analysis, measurement tool, and then if I click on one of these edges, yeah, 0.04 millimeters tall. So they're very, very thin. They would either end up with no material in them at all, or they would end up with such a thin piece of material that it could easily just be snapped away. But we can now take this part through into the molding analysis tool. So mold analysis that we covered this week. With this part on the screen, we can drop into molding analysis. We can set a material for it. I'm just going to go with the first material in the list. Okay. We can add a gate, which in this setup, we'd probably want to manually add a gate to the top of this column here. So that is where the material is going to be supplied. 3mm gate, yep, that's okay. Close. And then we could run our analysis. So the system's thinking about that now. We should get our analysis window. So yeah, we could set up a new analysis here. We could add it into the list, run the calculation. And now, hopefully, some of the areas that we were getting problems, such as air traps, the air may be persuaded to transition into these areas which are not intended to be on the finished part. These areas are consumable. If we have air traps in them, we don't care at all. So we've moved the air traps away from the moulding itself. And obviously there are areas on this mould design that could probably do with some more air traps added. We were having issues at the top of these clip features. So we could go back into the mould and we could do a similar extrude feature to add an air trap to the top of this, or maybe to the end of here, or maybe even over here as well. So we could use the same technique that we've used here, but target it at a different area of the mould. So yeah, hopefully that will give you a little bit more detail as to the extra mould features that you can put in to your generated moulds using the mould creation tools here. Other things that you can do with these moulds, you can add clamping features into the mould. So I think in this particular setup, if we were to put features on the corners of the mould over here that maybe were through holes that ran all the way through the top section and the bottom section of the mould, then we may end up having to increase the size of the workpiece slightly. So at the moment I think we've got an approximately 10mm offset away from the finished part. It may be that we may have to increase that somewhat. So if we increased it to a 20mm offset, which I've just done there, and then do a full refresh, then we've got a lot more material now that we can drill some holes through. So if you wanted to create some clamping holes now in the corners, what you would do is move from the mold tab through to the model tab, and one way of doing it would just be to use a simple extrude to remove the material through the upper half of the mold and the lower half of the mold. So that's all I'm going to do. So I'll click on extrude. The system wants me to select a plane to create a extrude sketch on. So I'm going to pick this top plane, or this top surface of the mold. And then I need some references to where the edges of the mold are. So I'm going to, before I begin sketching, I'm going to go into references, and I'm going to reference that edge of the mold and reference that edge of the mold there, and then close. Then I'm going to sketch a simple circular shape here, circular cross section for my hole. Then I'll reference it to be a distance away from the edges of the mold, so maybe 8mm, and then maybe have it as 10mm. That might be a little bit close, so maybe pull it inwards slightly, something like that. And then I can OK that sketch, so I'm clicking on OK up here to OK the sketch. I'm rotating my view just to get a better sense of what this hole is looking like. It's already set itself to remove material, so rather than giving it a depth, I think I'll just set it to through everything, or this option here, extrude to intersect with all surfaces. So click on that, it will remove material all the way through the two blocks, and then I can click on OK, and if I go back to shaded with edges, I can sort of get a sense of what I've done there. So if I open up this half of the mould, there's that through hole all the way through that half of the mould, and then if I open up the other half of the mould, there's the through hole all the way through. So hopefully with this tutorial you see now you can add those extra details into your mould design, details that affect the actual moulded part that comes out of the mould, but details such as mould features to do with clamping the two mould halves together.